All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into something I think is pretty fascinating and certainly relevant to a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely.
It is education reform in the U.S.
Big topic, yeah.
Specifically, we're going to be looking at the Department of Education. We're going to be looking at a proposal to, well, make some pretty substantial changes to the way things work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty radical proposal, I'd say. We're going to be looking at a chapter called Department of Education from this book called Mandate for Leadership. It's subtitled The Conservative Promise.
So obviously, this is I guess you could say a right-leaning perspective on education reforms.
For sure, for sure. But I think there's a lot in here that could be useful for anyone who's interested in education reform, no matter what their political persuasion is.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I said, it's a radical proposal. Like, it really gets into some fundamental questions about, like, what is the role of the federal government in education?
Yeah, and so, we're not here to endorse or, condemn this particular proposal. We just want to take a look at what it says and kind of unpack it a little bit.
Exactly. See what's in there.
Yeah, so let's just dive right in. The chapter starts off by painting a pretty, I don't know, maybe grim picture of the current state of education in the U.S.
They definitely don't sugarcoat it. They basically say that we've been spending trillions of dollars on education since 1965, and they're not really seeing the results.
Well, what kind of results are they talking about?
They cite a bunch of statistics, like from the NEEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. They point out that reading scores have been basically flat for 30 years, and that 4th and 8th grade math scores actually went down, like had their biggest decline since 1990.
Wow, that's pretty alarming.
It is, yeah.
You would think with all that money we'd be seeing, like, improvements across the board, but
You would think, right?
yeah.
And they highlight this too. Only a third of 8th graders are considered proficient in reading and math.
Hmm. So where's all that money going? I mean, that's the big question, right? If we're pouring all this money into education and we're not seeing the results, where's it all going?
That's what they're trying to figure out too. And one of the things they point to is just the massive bureaucracy surrounding education, especially at the state level.
Okay.
Like, they say there are over 48,000 employees in state education agencies. That's 10 times the number that work at the federal level in the Department of Education.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is, right? And there was this report from 1998 that found that states were spending nearly 50 million hours a year just on paperwork related to federal education funding.
Oh my gosh, 50 million hours? That's insane.
Just on paperwork.
Just to get the money.
Just to get the money, yeah.
That's unbelievable.
So you can see why they're kind of like, well, maybe this isn't working.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if all that time and money could be, better spent elsewhere, like, directly in the classroom or on resources for teachers and students.
Exactly.
So what do they propose?
So, and this is the really radical part.
Okay.
They're suggesting, like, getting rid of the Department of Education completely.
Whoa. Just get rid of it.
Just get rid of it, wipe it off the map.
I mean, that's a pretty drastic solution, right? Like, how do they even justify that?
Their argument is that it's become too bloated and inefficient. It's actually getting in the way of progress. They think that getting rid of the department would make the whole system less bureaucratic and more efficient.
Okay, so they're basically saying it's become too big, too slow, too bogged down in bureaucracy, and it's not actually helping schools or students.
Exactly. It's like this big lumbering giant that's just kind of crushing everything in its path.
Okay, so instead of this one giant department, like calling all the shots, they're proposing to what? Like spread those responsibilities around.
Yeah, exactly. They want to redistribute the programs that are currently handled by the Department of Education to other federal agencies.
So how would that work in practice? Like, give me an example.
Okay, so say Title I funding, which goes to schools in low-income communities. Right now, that's managed by the Department of Education. But under their plan, it would be moved to the Department of Health and Human Services.
Oh, interesting. So they're trying to match, I guess you could say, the programs with the agencies that have, like, the most expertise in those areas.
That's the idea, yeah.
Okay, but wouldn't that lead to, like, a patchwork of different approaches across the country?
That's definitely a concern, and one that critics bring up a lot.
Yeah, because, if you've got different agencies handling things in different ways, wouldn't that create inconsistencies and, make it harder to ensure that, like, everyone's getting a quality education?
Right, right. But the authors of this plan, they argue that the current system is already inconsistent. They say that giving states more flexibility would actually allow them to tailor programs to their specific needs.
Okay, so their argument is that local control is better than federal control.
Exactly. They believe that the best solutions often come from the ground up, not from Washington, D.C.
That's an interesting point. It makes sense, that local communities might have a better understanding of their own needs. but it's still a big gamble, right?
It is, yeah.
Like we're talking about potentially upending the entire education system.
And that's not all. This plan isn't just about rearranging who does what within the federal government.
Okay. What else is it about?
It's about giving more power to families.
Ah, parental empowerment. That's a big one.
Huge these days.
So how would they actually do that?
Well, one of their big ideas is the implementation of these things called education savings accounts, or ESAs.
ESAs. Okay, I've heard of those. So basically, that's like an account that holds a child friend of education funding, and parents can use that money for like private school tuition or tutoring or homeschooling materials.
Exactly. It gives parents more control over how their children's education dollars are spent.
Hmm. I see the appeal of that, giving parents more choices. But wouldn't that create a situation where, like, families with more resources have a huge advantage?
It's definitely something to think about. Critics worry about that, for sure. But proponents of ESAs argue that they would actually level the playing field because it would give low-income families the same choices that wealthy families already have.
Okay, so they're saying it's about, like, equalizing opportunity, not just giving more advantages to those who are already well off.
Exactly. They believe it would empower parents to be true advocates for their children's education, regardless of their income level.
Hmm. I could see both sides of that argument for sure.
And it gets even more complicated because they're not just talking about ESAs.
Okay,
They want to make all federal education funds more portable.
so what does that mean exactly?
It means that parents could use those funds for a wider range of options, not just the public school their child is assigned to.
So not just private schools, but also, like, tutoring, online courses, things like that.
Potentially, yeah, and they specifically talk about the importance of choice for kids connected to military families, those living in D.C., or who are members of sovereign tribes.
Okay, so it's about giving more control to those families who, I guess you could say, are already dealing with unique challenges and might not have as many options within the current system.
Yeah, exactly.
So this plan is really about, like, a fundamental shift in power, right? Away from the federal government, away from traditional public schools, and more towards parents.
Right. It's a pretty radical departure from the current system.
It is, it is. So we've talked about the Department of Education, ESAs, portability of funding. What else is in this plan? It sounds like there's a lot more to unpack here.
Oh, yeah, we've only just scratched the surface. There's a whole host of other policy priorities they lay out, from expanding charter schools to rolling back regulations they see as harmful.
Okay, so this is like a whole, like, a comprehensive vision for the future of education, at least from their perspective.
It really is, yeah.
Well, this is shaping up to be a fascinating deep dive.
Yeah. Buckle up.
I'm really curious to see what else they have in store. So let's take a closer look at some of those other policy priorities and see what else this plan has to offer.
It's not just big ideas. Either they get into, the nuts and bolts of how to actually do all this stuff.
Okay, so let's talk about it. Like, how do they actually envision dismantling a department as big as the Department of Education? I mean, it's not like you can just, like, snap your fingers and it's gone, right?
Right, exactly. It would be a pretty massive undertaking. They propose what they call a Department of Education Reorganization Act. It would be like a roadmap for the whole process.
Okay, so like a blueprint for, like, deconstruction.
Yeah, exactly, like a step-by-step guide.
That makes sense. Okay, so what happens once they have this roadmap in place?
Well, then they would do a thorough review of all the regulations related to education.
Oh, wow, that's a lot.
Everything from charter schools to student financial aid to Title IX to special education.
So are they just planning to get rid of all of it?
Not necessarily. The goal is to identify regulations that are, harmful or outdated or just don't align with their vision for education reform.
So they're trying to, like, streamline the regulatory landscape.
Exactly. Cut the red tape.
Okay, so what about the regulations that survive this, review process?
Those would likely be revised or clarified to make them more consistent with the new goals. For instance, they might change regulations around charter schools to reduce restrictions and make it easier for them to operate, or they might amend regulations around Title IX to address concerns about due process.
Right. It's all about aligning the rules with their emphasis on, choice and accountability and parental rights.
Right.
But isn't there a risk that, if you reduce federal oversight, you could end up with, like, lower standards in some places?
That's definitely a concern. It's all about striking the right balance between autonomy and accountability.
Right.
The authors of this plan, they believe that states are more than capable of setting high standards and holding schools accountable. And they think that competition and parental choice would also push schools to improve.
Right, because if parents aren't happy with the school, they can just take their kids and go somewhere else.
Exactly. So schools would have to really, up their game if they want to attract and retain students.
Okay, I can see that, but wouldn't it still create a lot of variation across states? Like, What about students who move a lot?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely something to think about. But the authors of the plan argue that because they're also making funding more portable, that would help to mitigate the problem.
Because families could take their funding with them wherever they go.
Exactly, so they'd have more flexibility to choose schools that meet their needs regardless of where they live.
Okay, so they're trying to create this system where families have more power and flexibility, but also where quality and accountability are maintained.
Right.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is for sure. But at the end of the day, it's all about trying to improve outcomes for students. And they believe that empowering parents and promoting choice is the best way to do that.
Okay, so we've talked about the Reorganization Act, the regulatory review, and this idea of shifting power to families. What else is on their agenda?
Well, they also get into some pretty specific changes they'd like to see within the Department of Education itself.
Okay, so they're not just waiting for the department to disappear, they're also trying to reshape it while it's still in operation.
Exactly. And one of their key targets is the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, or OEC.
Okay, OEs, that's a big one, right? That's the office that handles things like Title Life funding and impact aid.
Right, exactly. And they want to drastically reduce the number of programs that OECEL manages.
So what are they planning to do with all those programs?
Well, they want to transfer a lot of them to other federal agencies. Like, for example, they think that Title I funding would be better managed by the Department of Health and Human Services.
Oh, interesting. Why is that?
Well, they argue that HHS already has a lot of experience working with low-income communities.
Okay, so it's about matching the programs with the agencies that have the most relevant expertise.
Right, and they make similar arguments for other programs like impact aid.
So what do they want to do with impact aid?
They recommend getting rid of the portion of impact aid that isn't specifically tied to students and then transferring the student-driven portion to either the Department of Defense Education Activity or the Bureau of Indian Education.
Okay, so they're basically breaking down OEC piece by piece and redistributing its programs to other agencies.
Exactly. And the programs that don't get transferred to other agencies, they propose either block granting them to states or just eliminating them altogether.
Okay, so again, it's about giving more control to states and reducing the federal role in education.
Exactly.
It's interesting how that theme of decentralization runs through the whole plan, like both at the department level and in terms of giving more power to states and families.
It's definitely a central theme, yeah. They really believe that a more decentralized system is the key to improving education.
But they're not just targeting OEC, right?
Nope, they've got their sights set on other offices within the Department of Education, too.
Like which ones?
The Office of Career, Technical and Adult Education, the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, the Office for Post-Secondary Education, the Institute of Education Sciences, and the Office of Federal Student Aid.
Wow, so they're really going through the department with a fine-tooth comb.
They are. They basically want to, shrink it down and streamline it as much as possible.
It makes you wonder what would happen to all the people who work in those offices.
Right. That's a good question. They do talk about that a little bit. They say that employees whose jobs are essential to the mission would have the opportunity to transfer to other agencies along with their programs.
Okay, so it wouldn't necessarily be like a mass layoff. It'd be more like a reshuffling of the workforce.
Right.
But they're still envisioning a much smaller federal role in education, right?
Yeah, they think the federal government's primary role should be limited to things like gathering statistics, enforcing civil rights laws, and making sure that student financial aid programs are run responsibly.
Okay, so they're not saying that the federal government has no role to play. They just want to kind of pull it back a bit and let states and families have more control.
Exactly.
So to recap, we've got the Reorganization Act, the regulatory review, the restructuring of various offices within the department. What else?
They also propose a bunch of actions that would be taken regarding specific programs and policies even before the department is fully dismantled.
Okay, give me an example.
So, for instance, they want to phase out the existing income-driven repayment plans for student loans and replace them with a new plan that has clearer guidelines and is less prone to abuse.
Okay, so they're trying to address some of the concerns that have been raised about those programs.
Exactly. They want to make the system simpler and more transparent.
What else are they targeting?
They also want to get rid of Grad Plus and Parent Plus loans.
Okay, and why is that?
They argue that those loan programs are basically redundant and don't have the same safeguards as other loan programs.
So they're really going after the student loan system, huh? Trying to simplify it, make it more transparent, maybe rein in some of the costs.
Yeah, that's a big part of their plan.
Okay, what else?
Something else they propose is repealing the congressional charter of the National Education Association, the NEA.
Whoa, the NEA, that's a big one. That's the largest labor union in the country.
It is, yeah.
And they represent millions of teachers, right?
Millions of teachers and education support professionals.
Okay, so why do they want to revoke their charter?
They basically argue that the NEA has become too powerful and that it's more interested in protecting its members than in helping students.
Hmm.
They think that getting rid of its charter would weaken its influence and allow for more diverse voices to be heard in the education debate.
Okay, so it's all about, kind of shaking up the power dynamics in education.
Right.
What else?
They also want to strengthen legal protections for parental rights. They propose a federal Parents' Bill of Rights.
So that would basically guarantee that parents have the final say in their kids' education.
That's the idea, yeah.
Okay, again, it all comes back to that theme of parental empowerment.
It's definitely a recurring theme.
And it's interesting, because they see it as a way to both improve quality and increase accountability.
Right, they think that parents are the best advocates for their kids.
Yeah, it's definitely a different way of thinking about education. So they've got all these legislative proposals, but you said earlier that they don't stop there, right? Like they have other ideas about how to advance their agenda.
Oh, yeah, they also talk about executive orders that the next president could issue.
Okay, so they're not just relying on Congress to pass laws, they're also looking for ways to leverage the power of the presidency.
Exactly.
So what kind of executive orders are they talking about?
They want the next president to reinstate executive orders that promote transparency in government. And they propose new ones, too, like ones that would require grant applicants to say that they will uphold the First Amendment, protect the privacy of students' religious beliefs, minimize the requirement of bachelor's degrees for federal jobs, and take antitrust action against college accreditors.
Wow, so they're really thinking about all the different ways they could use the power of the presidency to make changes in education.
And they go even further. They even talk about agency policies that could be changed without any new legislation.
Okay, so it's like a multi-pronged approach. They're attacking this from every angle.
It really is, yeah. Like they want to see more transparency around complaints filed under FERPA and PPRA, the laws that protect student privacy and parental rights. They want to expand the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program to make it easier for more private schools to participate. And they want a bunch of reports done on things like the effectiveness of different education programs, the influence of family structure on student achievement, the impact of DEI initiatives, and how much federal funding actually makes it to the classroom.
So they're trying to gather more information, expose potential problems, and really make a case for their vision of the form.
Exactly. They're not just proposing changes, they're trying to build a whole movement around this.
Wow. It's pretty impressive, how thoroughly they've thought this all through. It's clear they see this as like a real fight for the future of education.
They definitely do. And they don't forget about the human element either.
Okay, good, because it's easy to get caught up in all the big ideas and policy debates, but ultimately these decisions affect real people.
Right. They talk about offering transfers to other agencies for employees whose positions are considered essential. They also call for a reduction in the overall workforce, but they say it should be done through attrition and reassignment, not mass layoffs.
Okay, so they're trying to be sensitive to the needs of the employees, even as they're working to shrink the size of the department.
Yeah. They recognize that this is going to be a disruptive process, but they believe it's necessary for the long-term health of the education system.
Wow, this has been a wild ride. We've gone from dismantling the Department of Education to empowering parents to overhauling student loans to, taking on the NEA. A pretty radical plan for sure.
It is. There's no doubt about that. But we've only covered half of what they talk about.
You're kidding me. There's more.
There's one more crucial piece we need to discuss.
Okay, well, don't leave us hanging. What is it?
It's the potential impact of all these changes. Like, how would this actually play out in the real world?
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the what and the how, but now it's time to get to the so what.
Exactly. What would this mean for students, teachers, and communities? What are the potential consequences, both positive and negative?
Let's do it. Let's dive into that next. Okay, so let's get into it. We've talked a lot about what they're proposing and how they're proposing to do it, but what about the impact?
Yeah, like what would this actually look like?
Right. What would this mean for, students, teachers, communities, the whole 9 yards?
Right, right. And the chapter actually does get into this a bit. They talk about the potential consequences, both good and bad.
Okay, so let's start with the good. What are the main arguments in favor of this plan?
Well, the biggest argument is that it would lead to more innovation.
Okay.
Like, by shifting power away from the federal government and towards states and families, you'd have a system that's a lot more responsive to local needs and preferences.
So it's kind of like that whole laboratories of democracy idea, right? Like, let the states experiment and see what works best.
Exact.
Okay, but wouldn't that also risk creating like a huge variation in quality across the country? Like you could have some states that are doing amazing things with education and others that are, kind of falling behind.
That's definitely a concern.
Yeah.
But the supporters of this plan, they argue that competition would actually drive up quality everywhere.
Okay, so how does that work?
Because schools would have to compete for students. Like, if parents aren't happy with the schools in their area, they can take their kids and their funding and go somewhere else.
Right, so the schools would have to, like, step up their game if they want to stay in business.
Exactly. And they argue that this would lead to more innovation because schools would be constantly trying to find new and better ways to attract and retain students.
Okay, I see the logic there. But wouldn't that also give a big advantage to schools in wealthier areas?
Yeah, that's definitely a risk.
Because, I mean, they already have more resources, they can offer better programs, they can, attract better teachers, all that stuff.
Right, right. But the proponents of this plan, they point to ESAs and the portability of funding as ways to level the playing field.
Okay, so the idea is that if the money follows the student, then it doesn't matter as much where you live, you can still access a quality education.
Right.
It's an interesting idea, but I imagine there would be a lot of pushback from, like, traditional public schools and teacher unions.
Oh, absolutely. They'd probably see this as a huge threat.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a pretty big change, right? Like, a lot of people would have to, kind of adapt to a whole new way of doing
For
things.
sure.
But, I think the authors of this plan would probably argue that the status quo isn't working, so something needs to change.
Yeah, they definitely make that case. They point to all the statistics we talked about earlier about stagnant test scores and achievement gaps. They basically say that the current system is failing too many kids.
Yeah, and, it's hard to argue with that.
It is.
But, okay, let's talk about the potential downsides of this plan. What are some of the risks?
One of the biggest concerns is that it could actually make inequality worse.
Okay, so how could that happen?
Well, some critics worry that if you start diverting funding away from traditional public schools and towards private schools and other alternatives, you could end up with a two-tiered system.
Where, like, wealthy families have access to all the good stuff and low-income families are stuck with, whatever's left over.
That's the fear, yeah.
Yeah, that's not good.
And then there's also the concern that without federal oversight, you might see a decline in quality overall.
Okay.
Like some states might lower their standards or cut corners to save money, and that could hurt students in the long run.
Yeah, you don't want to have a situation where, a high school diploma from one state is worth a lot more than a diploma from another state.
Exactly.
So it's tricky, right? Like, you want to give states more flexibility, but you also don't want to sacrifice quality or equity.
Right, it's a delicate balance. And then there's also the whole issue of disruption. Like dismantling an entire department is a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it's not going to happen overnight.
It's not, and critics worry that it could create a lot of chaos and confusion. Like, are other agencies really equipped to handle all the responsibilities that would be shifted to them?
Yeah, that's a good question. And even if they are, it's still going to be a long and complicated transition.
Definitely.
So, I mean, it's a risky plan, right? There's no guarantee that it will work out the way they hope.
Right, there are definitely a lot of unknowns.
But, at the same time, I think they raise some valid points about the current system, like something needs to change.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to deny that there are problems with the way things are now.
Right. And maybe this plan isn't the answer, but it's definitely a starting point for a conversation.
Absolutely. And that's really what we're trying to do here, right? Like, we're not trying to tell you what to think. We just want to present you with the information and let you decide for yourself.
Exactly. So we've laid out the plan. We've talked about the potential benefits. We've talked about the potential risks. Now it's up to you, the listener, to decide what you think.
Right. Think it through.
What parts of this plan resonate with you? What concerns you? How would this affect your community? How would it affect your own kids? These are all questions worth thinking about.
For sure. And don't stop there. Like, go do your own research, talk to people, get informed.
Exactly. The future of education is something we all have a stake in.
It really is.
So let's make sure we're all part of the conversation.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation.
It has. It's been a lot to process.
It has.
But, I think it's important to have these conversations. We need to be thinking critically about the future of education and what's best for our kids.
Absolutely. Until next time.
Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better future for all. And remember, the future of education is in our hands.